Africa has long been the forgotten continent, a place characterized by poverty, constant coups, tribal wars, and countless misfortunes. It's a region that has largely been ignored by companies, major economic flows, and investors worldwide. The question is, could this change? To what extent could the African continent begin to gain prominence in global markets? Well, dear friends, we present 3 key factors why Africa might start to matter much more than we think. Hello to all the community of Finance for All, welcome to another video. We're talking about a territory rich in natural resources, the second most populous continent on the planet, and a region where 60% of the world's population under 25 years old lives. Yet, despite this, Africa accounts for only 3% of global trade. In other words, we're talking about a region that has been completely sidelined in the major international economic circuits, a continent of over 1.2 billion people that does not participate in the process of globalization and the modern economy. To change this situation, in 2019, most African leaders officially ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area, a trade agreement among 44 countries that is now being gradually implemented. It is expected to become the largest free trade bloc in the world. And that's not all, the trade agreement might just be the beginning. To give you an idea, there is already talk of free movement of people and a shared monetary union. Additionally, in September 2020, China announced it would reduce tariffs on 98% of products imported from many African countries. In December, Washington hosted a summit of US and African leaders, the first of its kind in 8 years, with a clear goal: to boost economic relations. In other words, if Africa has been left out of international trade until now, that could gradually start to change. And you know what? The World Bank is very clear on this. The increase in trade could be the real tipping point for the takeoff of this forgotten continent. The global economy is a source of growth that African economies cannot afford to ignore. While African exports of goods and services have experienced their fastest growth in the last decade, volumes remain low, accounting for just 3% of global trade. But friends, commercial potential is not the only reason Africa should matter to you. Here's the second one. 2/3 of the world's population live in countries where the fertility rate does not even reach the replacement rate, 2.1 births per woman of childbearing age, the rate needed to maintain a stable population over time. However, the situation in Africa could not be more different. For example, in 2018, President Museveni of Uganda boasted that the country's population had jumped from around 14 million people in 1986 to over 40 million. We're talking about a nation where women have an average of 5 children, leading to a population growth rate of nearly 40% per decade. In fact, by 2050, Uganda's population is expected to reach 90 million inhabitants, more than any country in Europe, for instance. Another example is Niger. According to projections, between 1950 and 2050, the population of this country will have increased 25-fold, from 2.5 million to 60 million inhabitants. In Niger, women have an average of more than 7 children, a number that has actually increased in recent years, resulting in a median age of just 15 years. These are just 2 examples from a continent where nearly everything, culture, religion, and even politics, encourages high birth rates. What does all this mean? According to United Nations projections, by the middle of this century, and note that this is not far off, the African population will almost double to more than 2.4 billion people. This means that while in 1980, 1 in 10 people in the world was African, by the middle of this century, approximately 1 in 4 people on Earth will be from this continent. And that's not all. The most surprising part is that by 2050, 40% of all births in the world are expected to occur in Africa. As a result, by the end of the century, many experts, including the United Nations, predict that Africa's population will make up nearly 40% of the global population, for out of every 10 people, more than 4 billion individuals. Although this is an estimate, given current demographic patterns, Africa will account for at least 1/3 of the world's population. In other words, no matter how you look at it, this continent will increasingly have more weight and influence in the global economy. We're talking about large markets with hundreds of millions of potential consumers and the youngest workforce in the world. Pay attention to this. But we're not done yet. There's a third key factor that explains why Africa will increasingly matter to you. Dear friends, Africa is a relatively unexplored land. For instance, despite having 3 times the land area of Australia or Canada, in 2021, the mining exploration budget for all of sub-Saharan Africa was only half that of these countries. To make matters worse, the bulk of exploration is still focused on gold rather than rare earth elements or other critical metals like lithium, copper, or natural gas. Perhaps this explains why the exploration-to-discovery ratio is higher in Africa than in other regions of the world. In other words, with more investment, Africa could play a crucial role in the supply of key resources like rare earth elements. Rare earth elements are indispensable for the tech industry, with demand growing at over 11% annually. The problem for the United States, Europe, and other Western countries is that the majority of extraction, around 60% of the global total, takes place in China. Africa, however, could offer a significant alternative. Top 20 economies that are projected to experience the fastest growth rates in 2024, 9 are African countries. These are Niger, Senegal, Libya, Rwanda, Côte d'Ivoire, Djibouti, Ethiopia, the Gambia, and Benin. Niger will be not only the 3rd fastest growing economy in the world but also, surprisingly, the fastest growing in Africa. Following a coup d'état at the end of July 2023, Niger faced numerous economic sanctions, leading to its exit from the Economic Community of West African States. However, Niger possesses significant oil deposits, and with the completion of a 2,000-kilometer pipeline between Niger and Benin, the oil industry is predicted to generate a quarter of the country's GDP. Senegal, despite recent, now resolved, political unrest, will be the 2nd fastest growing African economy, likely due to its rapidly growing hydrocarbons industry. The years 2014 to 2017 saw the discovery of more than 40 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Overall, sub-Saharan Africa's predicted growth, 3.8%, is higher than the global average of 3.2% and makes it the 2nd fastest growing region in the world, after emerging and developing Asia, which has a growth rate of 5.2%. However, this aggregate number masks an important divergence in income growth between Africa and other developing regions. Finally, currency depreciations alongside reduced export earnings and inflation have conspired to knock Nigeria off from the position of Africa's largest economy to number 4, after South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria. Trade is an important mechanism for accelerating and expanding the sources of growth in African economies. And on this front, discussions around the future of the U.S. Trade Preference Program with Africa, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Of course, we're talking about a continent with severe issues, lack of legal security, high levels of violence, constant coups, widespread poverty, and more. However, as you can see, there are reasons for optimism. And let me tell you, it's very possible that during this century, we will witness a huge leap forward, if not for all of sub-Saharan Africa, then certainly for many countries within it. So, pay close attention because Africa could become a vital source of raw materials, labor, and trade for the rest of the world. But now that we've reached this point, it's your turn. Have you ever considered that this century might predominantly be Africa's century? Do you think we'll see this continent take off? Where do you think the greatest opportunities will be? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and let's start a discussion.